This is Splice.
Wow, how about that, huh?
I like that MAEKAN is a really well developed side gig for Adam Studios. You know, like he seems to refer to it as like a side thing, as an experiment out there in the wild that is loosely defined, and that's okay. You know,
That's right. I especially enjoyed the honesty in which he kind of talked about it. But wait, hang on. Let's rewind about 40 minutes so that you, the listener, knows what's going on.
Oh yeah, nobody knows what we're talking about. Nobody knows who we're talking about. This guy we're talking about is MAEKAN's founder, Eugene Kan. Eugene started out in Hypebeast as a freelance writer, just as the company was getting its feet wet in lifestyle media and that whole subculture thing. And what was his story, Alan?
So he left Hypebeast with a guy called Alex, who became his co-founder and started MAEKAN in 2016. And we kind of came across Eugene because he signed up to our newsletters in 2019. And we've been obviously kind of having this dance with him for a while. And it was great to finally have a chat.
Yeah, I actually wrote to him and I was like, hey, Eugene, where have you come from? And then, it's like, oh, I was editorial director with my, co-founder who's the creative director of Hypebeast. And I was like, whoa, Hypebeast, hold on a second. And that was back in 2019. And we were it was literally just before we did Splice Beta, our first beta in Chiang Mai in Thailand. And I was like, damn it, I wish we could have got you in there to come to Thailand and chat, because we wanted people from outside of traditional journalism and stuff.
That's right. And that's, by the way, for those of you who are listening to Splice Pink for the first time, we're Alan and Rashad. I'm Alan.
Oh, right. Wait a minute. You're Alan.
We haven't even said hello yet.
Let's say hello. Hello.
And that's Rashad. And Splice Pink is our little podcast where we talk to fantastic people in the media scene, people in the community that we so love and look up to. And this is a really great jumping off point into the conversation with Eugene Kan.
So, Eugene, I have a story for you to start out with. A friend of mine in San Francisco has a 16-year-old niece called Ruby. And, my friend and I would hang out with Ruby, who is super hip and plays basketball and has great hair and style. But it also meant that my friend and I, who are obviously much older, were fascinated, but we are a whole generational culture apart, as older people. And then you subscribed to my newsletter a couple of years ago. And you and I were like writing back and forth. And I immediately texted my friend saying, please tell Ruby, the ex-editorial director of Hypebeast, subscribes to my newsletter. And I feel like I need to impress her somehow. So thank you for that. My stock in Ruby's life kind of, went up a little bit temporarily. But so just to jump straight in, Hypebeast, I don't know, feels like it captured that generational divide. It was a very specific voice for a very specific audience.
Yeah, I think looking back on that era, and it's sometimes difficult to go back in time, like, circa 2006, 2007 or so, and just look at how. Just give me 1 second. Hey, Rena. Oh, sorry, I'm just recording something right now, so you might have to be a little bit quieter. Sorry, I just have someone popping in. But yeah, if I look back on, if I look back at 2006, 2007, I think the whole premise of digital media to where it is now, it seemed to move a lot slower relative to what it was. But I think that what was interesting about that moment in time was that because it was so subculturally driven, it definitely cut through a bit of the noise. I think right now that whole culture is a little bit different because I think the financialization of street culture, sneakers, all that other stuff has changed how people engage with it. And, people of all different walks of life are now part of it. I think for me, it's like looking at any sort of major city now, I think the age range of people wearing sneakers has definitely widened significantly, right? You're not at a point where you'll see, 45-year-old guys wearing the same sneakers as a 22-year-old. So I think there's something really interesting in that as a cultural device to link people. But I think from a media standpoint, I often say this jokingly, half jokingly, like I think Hypebeast was in theory a lot easier to build as a media entity back then than anything would be now because of the amount of things there are to do. And what I mean by that is obviously back then you had forums and you also had, blogs. You didn't really have streaming. You didn't have the same level of gaming that you have now. Social media obviously was just in its infancy. So there's a lot of things that are competing for our attention. And if you were diligent enough to kind of work through it back in the day, I think you're really reaping the rewards now of building a brand that is increasingly hard to build now if you were to start from scratch.
Which is a great kind of segue into what you're building with MAEKAN, because in a way it is kind of like that, and on the other hand it's not, and it obviously it takes a lot of lessons from Hypebeast, and also as you said, this new splintering of the space where you have multiple platforms, multiple channels, where you have to play your part, right?
Yeah. I think that's the one thing that for anyone that's kind of entering the space right now, it's quite difficult because you're meant to have some sort of engagement across multiple social media platforms. Like, when Clubhouse was big, let's say 6 months ago, 9 months ago, like, oh, now I have to have a presence on Clubhouse. It's Instagram, Twitter, Clubhouse, TikTok, etc. So I think that actually is increasingly difficult for people to be like, to do omni-channel well as a startup in the media space. So I think that's also one thing you recognize is that unlike selling a product, a physical product, the revenue curve that you generate is going to look a little bit different, right? And I think, traditionally there's been, how do I put this? I think that when I look at the financial side of media, I've grown a little bit, I guess, disenchanted with it all, because I think coming from the world I came from that was primarily ad driven to where it is now, it's just changed significantly. And it's not to say you cannot exist as like a solo, like one man sort of quote unquote media company, but I think increasingly it's quite difficult unless you position yourself in some sort of environment that allows you what I call like lumpier payouts, which are like more B2B things, right? I think that we like to talk a lot about which media companies have thrived, and obviously a lot of them are like subscription based, whether it's The Information or the New York Times, but I think you have to be very clear about your value proposition, because I don't think the information type approach necessarily fits within the realm of like entertainment culture, like a Hypebeast. So even for us at MAEKAN, it was always something that we were trying to come to terms with, because we had this romantic notion of telling culture a certain way and hoping people would obviously pay for it. And I think that the biggest learning was that coming from the world of like a Hypebeast or that product driven world, product has this incredibly powerful way of cutting through the noise. You look at it and you recognize really quickly, oh, do I like this or do I not like it? Am I interested to kind of continue pursuing this sort of rabbit hole, or am I not even willing to figure it out? Because that's the one thing for us. We were, I guess, a little bit more conceptual at MAEKAN, and in some ways that's to our detriment. It works well if you can lock someone in and someone's willing to go through the rigor to like understand what you represent. But without a physical product, sometimes it actually becomes a little bit harder for you to kind of put those hooks in.
So who's MAEKAN for then? It's cool to hear that you're thinking about product and an audience, and since you've done MAEKAN in since 2016, I'd be curious to think of how you're finding that audience.
Yeah, so for us, the audience was often about, I guess if I look back on where we came from and where we wanted to go with MAEKAN, I actually think that there was a big gap, and that after we left Hypebeast, like Alex and I, we, for whatever, I think it was more like a moment in time where we were kind of turned off from the world of streetwear and street culture and the overly consumeristic aspect of it. And I think at the time in 2015, we thought that was like the top of streetwear. Obviously, we were entirely wrong, and it's still going like 5-6 years later. But for us, we actually were really fascinated in just like the underlying aspect of ideas and thoughts and how it would sort of shape culture, and looking deeper into those. And they didn't necessarily have to be rooted in streetwear. It was more about like, how do you formulate an idea around culture and creativity, and how do you translate that into something tangible? So it was more cerebral in that sense. And because of that, I actually found, I think that was probably to our detriment, because when you don't, like, going back to the product thing, I think when you don't have a way for people to immediately understand you within the first, call it 10 seconds, then I think you're going to face an uphill battle. So I think even then, we haven't really changed too much how we've positioned ourselves, because I think it's really about asking intelligent questions and asking why certain things are happening. Because ultimately for us, in the world of stories that we navigate, it's like people, process, product, and we try to focus a bit more on the people and the process. So people that come to MAEKAN are ones that probably want to know why someone is doing something they're doing and how they're approaching it from a thought process level.
So it's been 5 years now into the business. So just by looking at your website, trying to figure out what the business model is, it seems like it's largely Patreon. Are there other components to it?
Yeah, so there's Patreon meets what was recently a launched e-commerce store. And then before that, this is actually kind of the interesting thing, is that we had the idea to do a publisher creative agency, 2-3 years ago. And we had limited success with it. It's not that we couldn't get clients, but I think that from a positional standpoint, it was hard to sell, because I don't think a lot of people go to publishers for creative agency services, even though they might have all the capabilities for it. So 2019 came around and we decided, why don't we just remove the creative agency part of MAEKAN, let it just exist as a publisher, and then create Atom Studios. So within Atom Studios itself, what changed was it was just a very clear and easy way for us to sell services. So, what overnight went from trying to get someone to come to us for something when they actually came to us for stories soon became so much easier when they found out we were doing Atom Studios, because I think a lot of people need some sort of clear division of what you're going to a certain entity for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of... Sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, and I would say, and I can elaborate a little bit on Atom Studios. It's at its core, it's like a creative agency. We do branding, strategy, content creation. So it's not really that different, but it's a lot of things that we were doing anyways with MAEKAN, but just splintered off.
Yeah, you mentioned curation as well. And, listening to some of your podcasts earlier, curation is something you have an opinion about. Most of our feeds currently are, algorithmically curated for us, right? But this classic idea of a human being rolling stuff out for other human beings to check out and to experience is still exciting, right? And but it's hugely difficult to do. I mean, we had stuff like social bookmarking sites like found.com and Cool Hunting, how are you doing curation now?
Yeah, I think that what I love about curation is that it's such a manual job, in the sense that it's like brute force. It's about how much you can take in, how much you can understand the world, and then go and identify where something's relevant to somebody. Like a good example, I was at physio yesterday, and my physio and I get along quite well because we both play football, play soccer. He is pretty big into it on the basis of the subcultural aspect. So I've been watching this show called Ted Lasso that's on Apple, and it's pretty popular. I think it actually is quite interesting regardless of whether you're a North American viewer, which I tend to fall within that realm because I was born and raised in Canada, and someone who maybe grew up from the British/European perspective. So for me, it was will I think this guy will like it? Yeah, I mean, he's pretty easygoing. He loves football, and I think there's sufficiently smart writing where I would feel comfortable recommending this to him. Right. And I obviously, as a quote unquote curator, I mean, the early days of Hypebeast, that's exactly what we did. We were just curating. We were picking and choosing things of interest that we thought were relevant to a demographic. So I think that's a continuation of that. But for me, I told someone this the other day. They asked me how do you get your information? I'm like, well, in some ways it's this inadequacy around the world, because that sort of is how we've built careers, is knowing how the world works. So curation for me has always been really interesting, and I like it when I am part of what is supposed to be algorithmic efficiency, only to see it fall flat. Because for me, I watch a lot of YouTube videos because I think it's the perfect amalgamation of entertainment, education, whatever it may be. And in the last 5-7 days, I've been so bored because my feed is all these things that they think I'm supposed to like, but I've moved past everything that they're trying to serve me. So that's kind of the interesting aspect of curation, is that in some ways the internet now has allowed you open and sort of carte blanche to go and find what you want to be into. And when we're sort of put down these lanes that are supposed to create engagement for us, I kind of like the fact that there's still a human element that can kind of come over top and still be successful amidst algorithms. And that's what's nice about culture too, is like no one knows where culture is going per se. I mean, you could theorize through statistics and whatnot, but there's, one of the examples I always like to use is that let's say for whatever reason, some guy's wearing a t-shirt from a brand. He goes and he engages in some heroic act, and he's all over the newspapers globally, and suddenly that brand becomes relevant because he's wearing a t-shirt. Like, culture can't really predict that. But then all of a sudden it becomes part of the framework. And I think that's sort of the interesting and fun thing that I enjoy seeing is, in part trends, in part rationalizing where the world's going and trying to make sense of it all.
On this topic of trends, I read your editor's letter from March, the one that was titled "Slow Down," and in there you wrote, "When I was younger, I felt the need to create things that were never seen before, or that could earn themselves the title of being first. But I've recognized the value of being number one often brings with it some significant headwinds." Is that kind of what you're talking about here? Because in a way, you're interested in trends. You're interested in seeing what is first and what that creates as a result of that.
Yeah, I think that probably was maybe a part of like identity building when I was younger. It was like, hey, something you could hang your hat on, like always the first to identify this. But maybe as I get older now, I think there's a little bit different perspective where maybe even a more business orientated perspective comes into play, where you can definitely identify a trend, but you don't have to put it on the front burner. You're kind of putting it on the back burner and waiting for it to achieve a certain level of boil before you actually start focusing on it. And I think that's something that has been really interesting, because I would say MAEKAN circa 2016 was probably ahead of the curve for a lot of things. Like, we attempted to do a purely audio-based publication before I think podcasts really, really picked up. We tried to do like a hard-gated paywall, and we had to like design our own tools for that, which were both expensive and not necessarily the most efficient. Like, that was obviously predating Patreon and whatnot. Like, a lot of these things now would have been easier to just implement out of the box. And while it's nice to be like, I was first, I think you also recognize at this day and age, because of media fragmentation, it doesn't really matter how good your idea is. If you don't have distribution, then, what good is an idea? It's just kind of stuck in its own little corner. And that was frustrating to me, because I was like, oh man, like I was on this thing, 2 years ago, but because I personally wasn't big enough, I didn't have enough distribution, then I just kind of had to sit on the sidelines and wait. And like, you're dedicating all this time and energy into something that you yourself cannot really effectuate change. So I think that's like one of the interesting things. Like, especially if you look at it on a cultural level right now, like, there are only a handful of people that occupy certain, call it cultural areas, that can really move culture. I think in this day and age, I think obviously Kanye West is probably the one that has some of the most significant power. I think Kanye West is someone who has the most significant capability of really moving culture, right? Like, people look at him, like, I don't know if you guys noticed something he dropped in the last 24 hours. It's basically like a small little digital device that comes with all the stems and all the tracks from Donda, his latest album. And basically you're paying $200 for this thing, and you have the ability to go and modify and play with all the tracks. And that's something that some other artist could have done that, 6 months ago. But if he doesn't have the scale of Kanye, it'll just fall flat on his face. So I think maybe I'm becoming a little bit more practical as I get older.
So you get you're able to remix Kanye.
Pretty
as
much.
A fan. That's insane. I need to go check this out. Just talking about fans. I heard you mention again in another podcast, Making It Up. I heard you mention Lee Jin and the whole creator economy, passion economy thing, and she did that remix of Kevin Kelly's 100 True Fans idea for Andreas and Horowitz last year, I think the beginning of last year. What would be your take on that, or your tip for cultivating true fans? How do you work with that core fan believer audience?
That's a good question, because for me, I have no problem being super transparent with the way we approach things, because I think there's part of us within the MAEKAN world, we're like, hey, you know what? Let's build it, and then it can be what it wants to be, and that should have been sufficient direction for it to kind of like move forward. And I think that we definitely have a very passionate group of fans, but I would say that, is it like 100,000 people come to MAEKAN every day? Definitely not. So I think that even sometimes I question my own perspective on that, because in some ways MAEKAN has shifted a little bit, where it's gone from something that was meant to be its own standalone publication and company to one that now currently anyways is supported by Atom Studios. So because the two are almost on different sides of the spectrum, where one is free reign, which is MAEKAN, and the other one is a little bit more transactional and revolves around basically services, right? Client services. I think that they balance each other out. So in light of that, the only thing I can really suggest is that I think consistency and this desire to keep going, and I think consistency means both like cadence, how much content you put out, as well as consistency in ideas and messaging. Like that's sort of what I think is most critical. I mean, for better or worse, like everything now is a brand, and people like to follow things that they can immediately understand. And MAEKAN, like I said, is not easy to understand, but I think at least there's a consistent throughput there of what we do. And that really is about a little bit of a deeper dive analysis of creative culture.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about consistency. This is something that comes up a lot, right? A lot of people say if you want to stand out, you got to be consistent. You got to look a certain way. You got to be able to jump out on a feed. How do you think about that? How do you think about how MAEKAN comes across in a feed?
Yeah, I think this is something I talked to Alex about. I think previously we were probably a little bit more visually compelling, like in terms of the visuals photography. I think now it's morphed a little bit into more ideas and thoughts that are generated. But I think that part in itself is actually a really good question, because I think amidst all the stuff that's going on right now, identifying what you represent is one thing. And I think actually that part is arguably not that hard. Like, even a template that carries some sort of brand elements is probably sufficient. I think the flip side is actually more difficult, and that's like finding people of relevance in a fragmented world. So I almost think like my general perspective is that the amount of design that exists out there that's of what we would all deem to be mediocre, like there's tons of it, but it doesn't necessarily remove the efficiency of communicating a message. This is actually something I talked about with Charisse, my podcast host, yesterday. It's like, McDonald's might be the world's most well-known restaurant, but does that mean it's good food or bad food? Like, this is a thing to question. So I think that finding the people that will derive value from your product is probably more important than standing out in terms of pure organic interaction. I'm not sure if that answers your question, because I kind of twisted it to make it kind of align with my own thought process on it.
No, I think it's useful. I think, a lot of people struggle with this, right? How far can you take the way something looks and make that relevant across all different platforms? Like, MAEKAN does. I mean, you're obviously on the main social media channels. You're also on podcasts, for example. Your articles have a way that they look and they feel, and it really depends on what the container is in all of these cases.
But I guess container is a good word for it. In fact, I love the stuff in your store, which is a whole other, container or surface, for you to get your brand out. I definitely want that single-use camera, and I'm wondering about how you think about, your experience from streetwear, e-commerce, bringing that over from Hypebeast to MAEKAN. what have you learned about that journey?
For us, we have a very specific point of view on it, in that a lot of streetwear retail, especially in the realm of just general retail, is primarily wholesale driven, or was wholesale driven. Like that's how a lot of brands were able to derive some sort of place in this world, like great curation, etc. But I think obviously with digital e-commerce and whatnot, your curation became less and less relevant. Like you weren't going to stores to shop. It became a race to the bottom. Who had the best sales? You generally wait till the end of the season to buy stuff. And I think that's something that's definitely not going away. So for us, our point of view was really about who are people that we personally can create exclusive products with. You know, I mean, that is sort of like the streetwear 101 of like just creating exclusivity, right? And then I think ultimately beyond that, we were thinking, what are people, what are brands that we personally resonate with and we feel we can tell an interesting story? I mean, to be honest, we had how do I put this? We had a lot of ideas for a store for a long time, but we just, you know, for various reasons, we just didn't get around to it till recently. But I think that of all the e-commerce / publishers out there, I think Hodinkee is probably the best example, albeit, and I've mentioned this before, Hodinkee is in a very special place because, you know, for them to generate $500,000 in revenue is selling, you know, a few hundred watches. Think of how many t-shirts you have to sell to generate $500,000. So I think it's very different, or even candles or cameras or whatnot. So I think that while they are seen as sort of the darling of like how publishers should engage in e-commerce, they're definitely in the right industry to do so. So for us, I think that if you really want to build this thing out, there might be some sort of plans. I wouldn't say that we're even remotely set up to go that route, but I think O32C, which is a fashion magazine out of Germany, out of Berlin, who basically took the publication as one section, then developed their own sort of fashion line, and that fashion line itself has probably generated a decent amount of business as like a wholesale, you know, fashion line, right? They've done collaborations with like Adidas. So that would be a good example of where you could potentially take it. I think that we're constantly in this identity crisis at MAEKAN, because we're always like, well, where do we want to go? Like, I think, like, you know what I said, I wish we had more visual stories, but then the visual stories might have to go down a certain route where it's maybe less conceptual. It's just really about some nice photos, right? And then on top of that, it's like, oh, well, maybe if people really resonate with our art direction and our creative direction on product, we start subtly pivoting towards that. And I kind of feel that's in the books as well for us, is that the stories we tell most ideally would track back to some product. And then we kind of showed a little bit that with the Dispatch tote bag we released, because to us, if I can't tell a story about your product, should I even deserve to create it in the first place, is my philosophy around it. So I think there's a lot of things that are kind of going, that everything's always in flux with us. Like I don't think we've necessarily established what that exact sort of like point of stability is. But I also think that MAEKAN from the very get-go was trying to position itself as some sort of media experiment.
And that experiment has gone on for several years now, you know. So when we look at this intersection of commerce and community and content, we see that a lot of little media companies are trying to figure that out as well, especially on the commerce side of it. And, you know, Rishad and I talk about this all the time because we're like, hey, let's get some merch going. Let's get a store going. What advice would you give guys like us who have a community, who kind of have a brand? What do we need to think about?
I think that the most important thing is really to start small and to find small moments that can help you build up to something. Like, this is what's been super interesting in the last, call it like 2016 onwards. Media has been this incredibly powerful tool in fashion because there's so much identity generation through a publication's logo. Like if you're wearing a Fox News hat and I'm wearing a New Yorker tote bag or whatever, like already you've formed your own opinions and insights into somebody. So I think that that's something that's really interesting for us to sort of like start thinking about moving forward with. But yeah, I think what's really important is like for us, when we engage in this, we looked at opportunities where we could do relatively smaller runs of product that were still in some ways exclusive and or were a little bit more meaningful. So we do have like these very simple MAEKAN logo T-shirts, right? But then beyond that, we also wanted to think about, well, what's the Splice perspective on ideas and topics that are near and dear to you guys, like that are relevant to you, and how do you work with people in your community to make that appear a little bit more unique, right? And I think that there's nothing against logo shirts, but I think that people in media should have sufficiently broad understanding of who they are, what they represent, and what their community wants. And that's sort of the nice sandbox you're drawing out. And in that sandbox, you're sort of developing products that could speak to your audience. But I think, yeah, it's really like from a financial perspective, it's probably also just taking smaller bets.
I like what you said about moments, that whole moment marketing, again, I don't need to commoditize it or something, but you said, be clear about who you are and what you stand for and what your community wants. And the one thing that, as the design guy, loosely speaking, of Splice, I'm kind of trying to do T-shirts that capture somewhat this media zeitgeisty thing, but without putting our logo on it, because that's completely opposed to any principles that we stand for.
But I think what I also realized too is that at some point in time, like when you put out product into the world, or you're creating this physical experience with other people, like sometimes you just have to let go of the reins and let the outside world determine how they want to interact with your brand or product. And I think that's what's really interesting, is that for me personally, there are certain things I'm not into, but I recognize that this is what maybe our community's into. And depending on how you position it, like for us, the product side was often seen as not just a revenue stream, but just also a marketing tool. And it was so interesting to see people interact with a bag. Like we probably got more interaction on our physical product than we do on like a story. Right. And I can understand why. Like one's like, oh, I look at it, I'm like, that's a really nice candle and it's shot well and it has great label design. And automatically that's a lot easier for someone to understand than someone talking about like the challenges of growing as an artist, let's say. Right. Those are two different things that take different amounts of time, dedication to understand.
I'm excited about what you're calling an experiment, making it. It sounds like a really exciting idea. You're trying to, it's evolving. It's evolved with the way you've thought about the world and curation and audiences and media and culture since 2016.
Like I think the next move, and we've been kind of slowly plotting away at it, is just like some sort of application like of a NFT DAO approach. And I think that's like these two big buzzwords. But my general sentiment around where we are in that space right now, I think it's still very low hanging fruit. Like, I think if you look at art and whatnot, that was to me sort of the low hanging fruit of these speculative assets that doesn't mean they cannot exist. But I think the functionality aspect was definitely not considered, or people recognize how difficult it was to like program. And I mean program, I don't mean like from a coding perspective, but create programming for functionality. So for us, it'd be quite simple. It's like, hey, if you are a Patreon member, we'll give you a sort of an NFT that in itself probably has some visualization component, but also it's more like a pass, right? It's a pass to like our Discord. Maybe it's discounts on our e-commerce store. It's the ability to vote on what the next color t-shirt is. Like we kind of did small experiments like that. Like what is the design you guys want to see? Or, if we're going to design a second tote bag, what are updates to the first one that you want to see? And I think that is, it doesn't need to go out and be the most complex thing from day one. I think just understanding what that looks like. Because for me, if in 5 years' time, MAEKAN was running itself and like I didn't really have to be involved in the day-to-day beyond just like keeping abreast of where I think things could go, like subtly, right? That would be I'd be more than happy for the keys to be relinquished. And it's a community-driven initiative. And also, how do you create reward? How do you pay people for the time, effort, etc.? I think those are like interesting concepts, because at this point in time, MAEKAN as like the quote unquote experiment isn't really about me having this goal or aspiration to be like let's say $100 million media company. It's actually more about how do you create connectivity and how do you bring people together to arrive at consensus on a broader level to like move culture forward, right? So I think that that's the thing that's kind of that gets me excited. But then again, there's a lot of people that are trying to overcomplicate things, and I think taking one step at a time, especially in new and likely not fully understood worlds, is probably the right approach.
Which brings me, to a question about success. Is that what success would look like for you around MAEKAN?
I think success for me, like number one, let's achieve some sort of financial stability where it's not Atom Studios that's paying the bills. It's like, Atom Studios pays the bills, albeit we run pretty lean deliberately. But I think, trying to create handbooks that other people can jump off of and develop and build their own entities, their own businesses, I think that'd be perfect for me. Because I don't really need to be the gatekeeper, but let me sort of be the experiment. Let me figure out what worked and what didn't work. You derive those learnings and you go and do your own thing. Because I think also from a personal standpoint, this is just me personally, like having been in this media thing for a while, like I wouldn't say that I have the same level of energy to create. And I think my role within this whole framework has changed a bit. Like, when I was 25, like, okay, sure, you'll listen to a 25-year-old on what's cool, but like, dude, I'm like 38 now. Like, I don't think people are going to look at me and be like, yo, this is what's cool. This is what's not cool. It's more like, let me help provide some guidance for that next generation to figure out how to make things happen, how to execute. That's really what it comes down to.
I think you've given us a lot to think about here. I think this is also very useful to our community. Anyone who's trying to build something today needs to struggle with all these questions that you've kind of raised here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eugene. This is really helpful. Thanks for your time. Yes.
Yeah, anytime. I'm a big fan of the newsletter too. And when it first popped up, I was like, oh, this is really interesting because I think that this is my outsider's take on what you guys do well. It's really about this very well articulated and deep dive exploration into the role of obviously media in Asia, but also the graphic and visual design aspect of it. And I think that's something that in this part of the world, because graphic design, photography, the arts, etc., are, I guess, not as, I don't know if respected as world, but I guess we don't put as much weight into it as, the Western world. I think it's really nice for people to reframe their thinking in Asian media on what role creativity has in their job and how they can maybe even be more efficient and tell better stories.
Wow, I'm glad we got that in tape.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eugene.